Welcome to this third plenary session today. It's called Maximizing Capacity of Science, Human Capital, and Knowledge Communities. My name is Curt and I'll have the pleasure of leading you through this session today. And just so that you know who I am, let me very briefly introduce myself by telling you that I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Tromsø, which, by the way, as a little curiosity, is the northernmost university in the world. So you imagine your idea about where the world ends. It's just past that. Yeah. Yeah. I've been involved in the gender summits from the very start. I was a participant in the GenSet project that gave birth to these. And I'm also the head of Norway's Committee on Gender Balance in Research, which advises the government of Norway and which aspires to motivate research institutions to think and act in new ways on gender equality issues, including gendered perspectives in research. In addition to that, I'm an eager user of Twitter, and some of us have been having various debates throughout the day on Twitter, which I've enjoyed. And I write quite a bit about some of the issues we're discussing these 2 days, including on my blog. For example, there's an article there about the Norwegian policy that you heard about this morning, so you might like to swing by and check that out. And if you're not tweeting, there's lots of action at that GS4 EU hashtag, so have a look. Our session this afternoon is going to be organized in the following way. I'm going to have a few introductory comments, and then we're going to have our 4 distinguished panelists discussing the issue at hand. We have figured out that they can each use about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end for your reflections or your specific questions as well. So let me turn a little bit to a few thoughts about the content. The session is about human capital, among other things. Its title alludes to the kind of argumentation that we're all familiar with here, namely that gender balance and gender equality work offer societies better access to the best of human capital. And we all know that the challenges to this are many. We've heard, for example, mention of implicit bias from several speakers today, and we've seen the effects of implicit bias in a number of studies. There's actually a growing body of literature on this topic. In fact, later today, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is going to publish yet another article on this topic. This one is called Elite Male Faculty in the Life Sciences Employ Fewer Women. And it shows that part of the problem with increasing the number of women faculty in the natural sciences is from the employment patterns at the very most prestigious labs. This work, by the way, is by researchers at MIT and Twitter. So if you haven't done so yet, that particular comment might deserve a tweet. The article that's being published today actually shows a difference between the behavior of men and women heads of labs. So we're starting to see in this literature a distinction between the findings of simulations, such as the John Jennifer study we heard about this morning, or the recent study that several of us saw about simulating queries from potential graduate students and how those are responded to, where we don't see a difference between men and women. And that contrasts with studies like the one that's going to be published later today, which look at actual data about these labs. And of course, the actual data is dirtier, and it has more variables that can't be controlled for. So the absence of a difference between men and women when it comes to implicit bias might be a topic that we're not yet done studying. The researchers who wrote the paper that's being published today, they have a conception of self-selection and opting out that I disagree with, that you can read more about soon. But the point that I want to emphasize here is that from any of these studies about bias, we learn the following. We desperately want to believe that we are capable of recognizing quality when we see it. And study after study after study shows us that it's not so simple. In many situations, we're just not up to the task. We need to acknowledge this, and we need to imagine processes which, in fact, do not leave us on our own. We need processes that support our quest for selecting the best. That, I think, is a core issue in the conceptualization of human capital. So there are many such processes that can support us in this, and some of our speakers will touch on some of those. I'd like to take just a few minutes to mention the most controversial one and to put it on the table with what I hope could be a fresh perspective on institutional accountability here. I take the least controversial measure actually to be the one that we heard from Øyvind Hallén and the Research Council of Norway this morning, namely simple encouragement to keep in mind the role of women, and that, as we've seen in the Norwegian case, can have a huge impact. But at the other end of the scale, the strongest intervention is quotas. For example, in the form of insisting that a particular position go to a member of an underrepresented group, or that a particular percentage of a group must be made up of members of particular subgroups. So what's the common objection to quotas? Well, there's the one old one about them being unfair, but of course, quotas don't get introduced in situations which are already fair. They're a tool to pursue fairness, to correct unfairness. One of the things I hear most about quotas is that they necessarily lead to a reduction in quality. If you use a quota, it's said you will hire someone who otherwise wouldn't have made it. If you insist that companies put women on their boards, we hear in Norway, you'll lower the overall quality. That's the objection. That's the standard objection. That's the stereotype. But I'm here to tell you that this is exactly wrong. Research shows us that quotas can raise quality. And this, I think, is extremely important. I think everyone who is a friend of gender balance work needs to learn these arguments. The stereotype that I just mentioned is a classic case of basing conclusions on something other than research. It bases conclusions on logic, turns out to be bad logic, and stories. These stories like, oh, well, we had a woman president at our university one time, but that didn't really work out so well. They get told and told again and told again. They're anecdotes with such sufficient repetition that they start to get treated as data. We might call them anecdata. And anecdata are not useful when we're trying to build knowledge. So in the case of quotas, what does research show? Let me very, very briefly mention 3 studies. A simulation study that was published in Science in 2012 shows that affirmative action attracts more highly qualified women. The use of affirmative action measures in this study, that was including but not limited to quotas, leads to a change in the applicant pool. In fact, the inclusion of some affirmative action measure in the announcement of conditions had the effect of attracting more highly qualified women to such an extent that it was almost never necessary to actually use the affirmative action measure to get the desired gender balance. That's one case. A second case is from 2013, when Sweden's Research Institute of Industrial Economics published a study called Gender Quotas and the Crisis of the Mediocre Man. This is a paper that examines the effects of quotas on the lists that are advanced by political parties in elections. So political parties in Sweden put up lists of candidates for elections, and those lists should alternate between men and women. It's a so-called zipper quota on constructing the list that gives you 50% men and 50% women. The economists who wrote this article developed a set of measures of group competency, and they demonstrate that the zipper quota raises the overall competency of the groups, and in particular, it raises the competency of the group of men as a group on the list. Now think about that. What does that mean? Adding a zipper quota raises the competency of the group overall and the group of men. It means that mediocre men are being replaced by more highly qualified women. So the overall competency is raised because more highly qualified people replace lower qualified people. And for the group of men, overall competency is raised because the lower qualified men are no longer present. So this study shows that a quota on the composition of the group increases the quality of that group. That's a realization of the classic argument that we need to make use of all of society's resources, and it shows that exactly the opposite of the stereotype about quotas is what actually happens. Finally, just a third study published in 2014 called Socially Gainful Gender Quotas appeared just the other day in Elsevier's Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. And they argue about human capital. They have a measure of human capital. And I'd like to read you a quote from that article. The authors write, "We study the impact of gender quotas on the acquisition of human capital. In the absence of quotas, women consider their chances of getting top positions to be lower than men's. The lure of top positions induces even men of relatively low ability to engage in human capital formation, whereas women of relatively high ability do not expect to get top positions and do not therefore engage in human capital formation. Gender quotas discourage men who are less efficient in forming human capital, and they encourage women who are more efficient in forming human capital. We," they write, "provide a condition under which the net result of the institution of gender quotas is an increase in human capital in the economy as a whole." Getting the most out of human capital means successfully selecting high quality. We know that we stumble in our attempts to do this, and from my perspective, the obvious response to stumbling is to carry a crutch. We need help. We need interventions, and those can take many forms. But no matter what interventions we consider, it's important to identify them on the basis of research and not on the basis of anecdotes and not even on the basis of anecdata. Research is the route to knowledge, and when we look at the research on quotas, it turns out that what we thought we knew, that they necessarily lower quality, is exactly wrong. Both in terms of attracting stronger applicants and in terms of their impacts on groups, quotas increase quality. That's what the research tells us. Well, what should we do with this knowledge? Should we introduce quotas for awarding research funds? Should we start out team building processes by considering quotas? Certainly these arguments about how quotas raise quality should be included the next time someone has to take a quota case to court. But enough on this most extreme measure. Let's hear more about maximizing capacity. Let's turn now to our distinguished panelists. And I'd like to start